There is a reason people who grew up in the 1970s still carry themselves differently. You can hear it in the way they talk about childhood. You can feel it in the way they handle silence, disappointment, boredom, and stress. Something about that decade left a mark that never fully went away. It was not just the music, the fashion, or the memory of summer evenings that seemed to last forever. It was the way everyday life shaped the mind. The world they grew up in demanded something from them early, and in giving that, it quietly built a kind of resilience that feels rare now. Childhood in the 1970s was not scheduled to the minute. It was not watched from every angle. It was not constantly explained by adults. A lot of it happened without supervision, without a safety net, and without someone stepping in at the first sign of discomfort. And that changed people. Not because hardship automatically makes someone better, but because repeated small moments of independence slowly taught a child how to function without needing constant direction. Back then, freedom arrived early. A kid could finish breakfast, head out the door, and disappear into the neighborhood for hours with almost no real plan. You had a bike, a few friends, maybe a scraped knee from the day before, and an entire afternoon to fill. Nobody handed you an itinerary. Nobody turned your day into a managed experience. You just went. You knocked on doors. You wandered to the park. You cut through alleys and backyards. You invented games with random objects and turned ordinary places into whole worlds. A ditch became a battlefield. A patch of trees became a kingdom. A cardboard box became whatever your imagination needed it to be. That kind of freedom did something modern childhood often struggles to recreate. It forced children to become resourceful. If the game got boring, you changed it. If someone got upset, you dealt with it. If the plan fell apart, you came up with another one. Life was not always comfortable, but it was active, improvised, and real. Kids were not just being entertained, they were learning how to think on their feet. And because adults were not always hovering nearby, children from that era learned to pay attention in a different way. They noticed moods, they noticed tone, they noticed when a situation felt off. You learned which house felt warm and welcoming, and which porch you should avoid. You knew which older kids were joking and which ones were trouble. You understood things without needing them spelled out. That kind of awareness was not taught in a lesson. It came from moving through the world and reading it for yourself. There was also something powerful about the quiet hours, the time after school, the empty house, the sound of the key in the door, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the television turning on in a dim living room. For many children, that was normal. They made their own snack. They started homework on their own. They sat with themselves. And whether they realized it or not, they were practicing self-reliance every single week. Not in some dramatic, heroic way, but in small, repetitive moments that taught them again and again, you can handle this. That matters more than people think. Because when children repeatedly experience manageable independence, they begin to trust themselves. They stop assuming that every problem requires rescue. They become adults who do not immediately freeze when something goes wrong. Their first instinct is often simple. All right, what do I do now? And then there was boredom. Real boredom. The kind with no instant escape, no endless feed to scroll, no device waiting to flood your brain with stimulation the moment life got quiet. In the 1970s, boredom was not treated like a crisis. It was just part of being alive. You lay on the carpet, you stared out the window, you shuffled through comic books, you called someone and hoped they were home. You kicked a ball against a wall, you sat in that restless space until your mind finally made something out of nothing. That may sound small, but it shaped people deeply. Because boredom, when it is not immediately erased, becomes a doorway. It pushes the mind to create, imagine, invent, reflect. It teaches you that discomfort is not always something to run from. Sometimes it is the beginning of an idea. People who grew up that way often still have a higher tolerance for stillness. They do not panic as quickly in silence. They do not need every moment filled. They learned long ago that an empty afternoon is not the end of the world. The 1970s also taught patience in ways younger generations rarely had to experience. Waiting was built into daily life. You waited for your favorite TV show. You waited to use the family phone. You waited for a letter, a ride, a holiday, a new toy, summer vacation, the weekend. Anticipation was normal. You could not have everything right now. And because of that, good things carried more weight. They felt earned. They felt larger in memory because they were not instantly available. That slower rhythm left its own psychological imprint. It trained children to live with desire without being consumed by it, to want something and not immediately get it, to look forward to things, to let excitement build. And maybe that is part of why so many adults from that generation still seem steadier under pressure. Their minds were shaped in a world where delay was normal, not failure. Then there was physical risk, not reckless for the sake of it, but ordinary childhood risk. Climbing higher than you probably should have, jumping off things because your friends did, flying downhill on a bike too fast, building something unstable and trusting it for longer than was wise. Kids got hurt sometimes. They came home dirty, bruised, embarrassed, and alive. But hidden inside all of that was another kind of education. They learned the difference between fear and danger. They learned where their limits actually were. They learned that some things look terrifying and turn out to be manageable, while other things deserve real caution. That is a different lesson than being told about risk from a safe distance. It becomes part of your nervous system. People raised that way often do not treat uncertainty as automatic disaster. They assess, they adjust, they continue. They have felt the sting of consequences before, and that tends to make them calmer, not weaker. Another overlooked part of that generation's childhood was solitude. There were long stretches when nobody was available and nothing exciting was happening. So, you spent time alone, not as punishment, just as life. You stayed in your room with toys, records, books, notebooks, models, or whatever small world you could build for yourself. You took solo bike rides, you thought, you daydreamed. You replayed conversations in your head. You imagined futures. You got used to your own company. That shaped adulthood too. Because people who grow up with some comfort in solitude do not always experience aloneness as something threatening. They are often less desperate for constant noise, constant validation, or constant connection. They learned early that your own mind can be a place to live in, not just a place to escape from. Even emotions work differently in a world like that. When something painful happened, a fight with a friend, a humiliating moment at school, a bad grade, an argument at home, you often had no immediate outlet, no social media, no instant group chat, no endless stream of reassurance waiting for you. Sometimes all you had was your room, the ceiling, your thoughts, and time. So you felt what you felt: anger, shame, sadness, frustration. And slowly, often without realizing it, you learn that emotions rise, stay for a while, and then begin to pass. That is not the same as never opening up. It is not about pretending pain is not real. It is about developing an inner capacity to endure a feeling without immediately needing to discharge it. Many people from that era were trained by life itself to sit inside an emotion without assuming it would destroy them. That kind of emotional stamina becomes incredibly valuable later, in work, in love, in conflict, in grief, in ordinary adult stress. Failure taught them too. You did not make the team. You messed up in front of classmates. You lost. You broke something. You got blamed. You felt embarrassed. And then, more often than not, life moved on. There was no elaborate emotional cushioning built around every disappointment. That could feel harsh sometimes. But it also sent a message. This moment hurts, but it is not the end of you. Try again, keep going, learn something. Over time, that turns failure into information instead of identity. It becomes something you survive, not something that defines you forever. And that may be one reason people raised in the 1970s often seem less fragile when life does not go according to plan. They were disappointed many times before adulthood began. They had practice. Even friendships were different. Children were left to work out more of their own social world. They had to figure out loyalty, exclusion, teasing, apology, group tension, and shifting alliances without an adult translating everything for them. That does not mean it was always better or kinder. Sometimes it was messy, sometimes it hurt, but it forced kids to become sharp readers of people. They learned who meant what they said, who did not, who could be trusted, who liked attention, who held grudges, who followed the crowd, who stood their ground. That is why many people from that generation carry a very particular kind of social instinct. They can sense tone quickly. They notice what is not being said. They often read a room before they speak. They were trained in subtext long before they had words for it. And maybe that is what people are really noticing when they say those who grew up in the 70s seem different. It is not just nostalgia for old bikes, wood-paneled living rooms, or the glow of a television in a quiet house. It is not just affection for a vanished analog world. It is the feeling that those years produced adults who were shaped by a different rhythm of life, a slower rhythm, a rougher rhythm, a less managed rhythm, one that demanded patience, observation, improvisation, and emotional endurance. They were not given constant stimulation, so they learned imagination. They were not rescued from every discomfort, so they learned recovery. They were not watched every second, so they learned judgment. They were not endlessly reassured, so they learned how to steady themselves. And all of that stayed with them. That is why, decades later, so many of them still seem grounded in a way that is hard to explain. They know how to wait. They know how to sit quietly. They know how to be bored without collapsing into it. They know how to be alone without feeling erased. They know how to take a hit from life and keep moving, not because they were superhuman, not because everything about that era was perfect, but because the world that raised them demanded inner strength before anyone thought to call it that. Maybe that is the real legacy of growing up in the 1970s. Not that childhood was better in every way, not that modern life has nothing to offer, but that an entire generation was shaped by freedom, friction, silence, risk, and time. And those things built something lasting. Something quiet, something strong, something you can still feel the moment they begin to talk about what it was like to grow up when the world was slower, wider, and far less eager to step in before life had a chance to teach you something on your own.